All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Aaron Grade, a PhD candidate at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and welcome to a special edition of Life Science Cafe, a COVID-19 panel. So, Life Science Cafe is organized by graduate student scientists at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Each month, we invite experts in a field of life science to discuss their research and answer your questions about their field. Typically, we host these events in the Amherst community, but in light of recent events, we've moved to an entirely online format. Before we begin, we'd like to thank our funding sources, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass, UMass Graduate School Senate, UMass Graduate School, National Science Foundation, and UMass gives donors like you. We're happy you joined us for this special panel. It's going to be in a webinar format. And if you haven't attended a Science Cafe before and are interested in attending some in the future, please subscribe to our mailing list found on oebsciencecafe.org. Our next cafe is going to be really cool. It's also going to be on Zoom, and we're featuring Dr. John Rowan next week and his research on paleontology, new insights from old bones. And if you subscribe to our mailing list, we'll be sending this advertisement out, and it's also on our website. So stay tuned for future cafes. We received a lot of amazing questions from those who registered for this event. We're going to try to get through as many as we can by directing questions to individual speakers and pausing several times during the event to take live follow-up questions from you. We've gotten some questions from people who said that they aren't shown and they can't say anything. That's the webinar format. And basically what you're going to do is look at the bottom of your screen, there's a question and answer box. And you could type in any of your questions and raise your hands at the bottom of that screen. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So with that, I'm going to let our speakers briefly introduce themselves and their topics of research. And we will start with Dr. Andrew Lubber.
Hey everyone, I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist in the School of Public Health and Health Sciences. I'm involved in several aspects of COVID response, including work with the Academic Public Health Volunteer Consortium here in Massachusetts, some modeling work through the Department of Public Health, and then finally we're starting a serological survey for the whole UMass community in the next few weeks.
Excellent, thank you. All right, Dr. Matthew Moore, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm in the Department of Food Science. I focus on applied and environmental virology, traditionally sort of studying foodborne viruses, but sort of because of that applied environmental aspect, we have a number of projects that hopefully will get funded related to SARS-CoV-2, including one that's ongoing right now that we're getting back in lab. It's part of a collaboration with UMass Medical and Bay State.
Great, thank you. And it's, hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly, Linda Tropp. Would you like to introduce yourself, Dr. Linda Tropp?
Yeah, hi. I am a social psychologist in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, and most of my research focuses on prejudice and challenging relations between groups and what strategies we can do to improve relations between groups.
Excellent, thank you. Those were nice, concise introductions. I really appreciate it. And also to the panelists, if you do have any figures or things that you would like to share, you could share your screen. I believe I enabled that, but obviously you could just take standard questions and answers too. So how I'm going to handle this is that we're going to go through and go panelist by panelist, and we have a bunch of great questions posed to us from everyone who registered, but I would also like to have a chance for live follow-up questions. So what we'll do is we'll go through the questions and then we'll answer some questions from the audience after. So for the audience, when it comes time to take audience questions in the Q&A, you could type the question directed at the panelists that we're speaking to. And then at the very end, we'll do a wrap up where it'll just be a free-form question and answer where all three panelists could answer any questions that people have. So this should be pretty interesting. So we're just going to start with the basics of the virus itself. So these directions, these questions are going to be directed at Dr. Lover. And we're going to start with the very basic question that we got, which is, how is COVID-19 different from other viruses? And also people would like to know, how accurate is testing for this virus at this time?
Yeah, so it's quite different simply because no one on the planet has immunity, aside from the places that have had really high transmission. So everything like measles and mumps and rubella, either through vaccination or infection, a lot of people are protected. And so now we have a brand new pathogen that no one has seen before. And that's really the main thing that makes this a huge public health crisis. The age distribution of severe disease is also a bit unusual in terms of the very elderly being the vast majority of mortality. And then in terms of the testing, you've probably heard a lot about two different tests. One of them is a swab test, which you get in your nose or behind your nose in your sinuses. That one, the test itself is very reliable. However, the virus isn't at a constant level in your nose. So depending on exactly when someone takes the sample and kind of how aggressive they are with putting the swab in, it's really uncomfortable. So that's one challenge. So that can lead to problems. The antibody tests, in terms of looking at have you been infected in the past, are getting to be really very accurate. But there's huge development in that right now. So they'll be getting better and better even still.
Great. And a follow-up question on that, how is COVID-19 different from other strains of coronavirus? We hear, especially in the media, the words coronavirus and COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 and all these being thrown around. So could you just describe some of the differences?
Yeah, so there are 4 kind of routine coronaviruses that cause colds and upper respiratory infections every winter. So usually kids have, all kinds of random respiratory things, and coronavirus is one of those, or the 4 coronaviruses. The other 3 are MERS, so the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, and then SARS-1, which we had the epidemic in 2003. And those 3 are a lot more serious in terms of the outcomes. So we've all been exposed to coronaviruses in general, but not to the 3 that are a lot more serious for us.
Okay, great. That clears things up a little bit. You just hear it being, called all sorts of things. I know the media started with kind of calling it coronavirus. There was this whole issue with Corona beer. People were scared they could get it from that. So maybe Dr. Moore could talk a little bit about that.
The nomenclature changed several times from the start of the epidemic in January, and then WHO had guidance, and so that definitely led to some confusing situations.
Sure. Now, going to transmission, I know a lot of people have a lot of fear and anxiety about transmission in particular. So how is this virus transmitted? What surfaces does it live on, and where do people primarily get it? Is it through fabrics, through surfaces, through the air, those sorts of things?
Yeah, so it's primarily droplets. So when someone sneezes or coughs, little tiny droplets of saliva and mucus spray out. And that's usually about a 6-foot radius. And then they kind of drop to the floor and are not too much of a problem. And that's the big difference between aerosol and droplet. So some infections, like measles, stay suspended in the air for a long period of time. And SARS-CoV-2 does not appear to do that. Most of the transmission is that, and then potentially also surfaces. So doorknobs and keyboards and anything where multiple people handle it in a short period of time. In terms of the residency time on surfaces, there's a little bit of data that says a couple hours to maybe a day under kind of ideal conditions on plastic or metal. But there's not a huge amount of data yet.
Okay, yeah, we had some interesting questions about surfaces. Someone asked, can the virus be transported on shoes? And should I take my shoes off before walking into my home?
Yeah. So there's a small study from a hospital in China where they actually tested people's shoes, and they did find some viral RNA, which means that there was traces of the virus. Whether or not it was actually infectious and able to transmit is not very clear yet. So I think it doesn't hurt to take your shoes off, but it certainly is not the main transmission. Looks like Matt has something to add to that.
Yeah, that's kind of our wheelhouse. We actually have a couple proposals about that. Yeah, people are kind of, freaking out. Like the first thing is to note that there's a difference between detecting viral RNA and detecting infectious virus that can actually get you sick. Especially with viruses like this, which have sort of a lipid envelope around the outside of them. What can kind of happen is that envelope can degrade and then it's no longer infectious, but the RNA can still hang around and you can detect that. And the methods that you use to detect it really just detect a portion of the RNA. So even if it's partial or partially degraded RNA, as long as that small portion you're trying to amplify is there, you're detecting it. So there's a huge distinction. So like there was a headline a couple of days ago where it's like they detected it on a surface like 17 days after. Well, that's because they were detecting RNA. When you actually look at the infectious virus, you really only see it for like about a day or a couple of days, depending on the load of virus you put on whatever surface.
Great, thank you. And I think both Matt and Andrew could speak to this, but can you give us some advice about preventative measures? We hear social distancing as a word that's basically entered our common vernacular at this point. And then mask wearing, we've seen some states are very strict about masks, others aren't, and the requirements have really changed about mask wearing over just a period of about a month. And specifically, the 6-foot rule, is that accurate? Mm-hmm. And did they come up with that just as sort of a random number, or does 6 feet really protect you?
Yeah, I mean, the 6 feet is really well validated, not specifically for SARS-CoV-2, but for a lot of other respiratory viruses. You've probably seen pictures, like black and white pictures of someone sneezing and there's this kind of plume that goes out. You can do fancy studies where you actually look and see what the radius is where those droplets land. And yeah, even under ideal conditions, like 6 feet is about the max. So that's fine. Then in terms of mask wearing, it's important to realize there are 2 types of masks. The N95s are the ones that fit very tightly and are a little bit difficult to breathe in. And those protect the wearer. So that keeps you from inhaling droplets. The other ones that a lot of us are wearing are the just cloth masks. And those keep the droplets out. So if you sneeze or talk or laugh or something, any little droplets that may be infectious to other people are trapped in the fabric. So it's important to realize that healthcare workers are doing something quite different from what we all want to do as the general population.
Yeah, I second that. So, when you go out in public, the number one thing is just avoid getting close to other people. And always, if you're going in any situation, especially indoors, wear a mask. There may be some protective effect. I haven't seen any data that suggests like the common surgical masks or cloths can protect you, but you will to some degree reduce the risk of giving it to someone else. And so that's really key, is that everybody does it. So for those places that aren't enforcing it, it's really paramount, to support your community and be a good citizen, to really, wear a mask and try and respect social distancing.
And that's another thing that's very unusual about this virus, is that people are highly infectious before they have any symptoms. So usually you have a headache and you feel sick and you stay home, and then your chances of interacting with people to pass on the infection are pretty small. With SARS-CoV-2, there's probably a 1 to 2 or maybe even slightly longer period where people have a lot of virus in their nose and mouth and they have no symptoms. And they may never,
sorry.
And also a lot of people have no symptoms at all, ever.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of asymptomatic transmission. So those 2 facts together make mask wearing to protect your community especially important, because you may be infecting other people with no symptoms.
And how do we feel about
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry. How do we feel about mask wearing
No, sorry.
outdoors? So I got some questions about hiking. Does the distance change of transmission risk change if you're like hiking on a trail versus in a store shopping? Those sorts of things.
I mean, certainly a lot of air circulation helps. And if you go for a run by yourself in the forest, you probably don't need to wear a mask. So I think, it's a matter of using good judgment. So transmission for respiratory diseases happens based on the duration and frequency of contacts. So the more people you have close contact with for longer periods of time, the more likely that the chain of transmission will continue. So anything we can do to cut down either the duration or frequency. So the number of people you contact with or how close you interact with them is really the key. And that's the whole point of social distancing.
Yeah, I agree that, that thing, I agree that judgment is a big thing, and the risk is certainly much, much lower if you're outside. And so, also people do have to worry about, mental health as well. And so if you do want to go out for a hike or something like that, just be respectful of keeping a distance. But I don't know necessarily, especially if you're in a low population density, if you need to necessarily wear a mask, especially, if like you're jogging in the forest or something like that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And speaking of social distancing, so there seems to be a lot of confusion over the purpose of social distancing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems almost like it's like plugging up a drain, like slowing down the flow of that virus, but it's not just stopping it. As soon as you reinstate normal measures, you'll go back to people getting the virus. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's no reason right now that all the states that are relaxing their controls will not be exactly where they were before they started social distancing. And that's one of the big challenges for coordinated local and state level and federal response.
Yeah, I would definitely anticipate a second peak, and it'll be interesting to see what strategies that I know Andrew and a bunch of epidemiologists are thinking about with this virus, because one of the things that makes it unique is not only do you shed it asymptomatically and pre-symptomatically, but also it's very, very transmissible. And so, like the moment you let people back out, you've essentially taken that, that safeguard away, and you're going to start seeing it getting back into the community again, and people who don't know that they have it are shedding it and passing it on to other people. So yeah, I would expect that to happen.
Yeah. I mean, so one question someone asked was, how effective is this social distancing and stay-at-home orders if bordering states are not following similar protocols? There really isn't a coordinated federal, there's federal guidelines, but there's no coordinated between state by state. So what happens if one state here is instituting very strict social distancing and the state next door is not?
Yeah. There's no reason that a big infection or epidemic in one state won't impact everyone in the country and potentially globally. Viruses don't have a passport. So
yeah, and outside of like travel bans, like strict travel bans or something like that, or like building a wall around Georgia or something, like you're not going to stop this from spreading and people coming in contact with each other and transmitting it.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about sort of an end to this, aside from social distancing, we've heard a couple things that might end this pandemic. I know we're all starting to think about when this thing is going to end. So there's been kind of confusion around these different terms. Social distancing, we've heard things like herd immunity, antibody tests, vaccines. Can you break down a difference between these strategies?
So social distancing is what we're doing right now, and basically just minimizing how often everyone in the population mixes. And that's really a stopgap measure to try and buy some time and to keep hospitals from getting totally overwhelmed. Herd immunity is where if a certain proportion of the whole population is immune, then those people act as kind of speed bumps for the virus, and transmission will stop. So if enough people have either been infected and recovered or have a vaccine, then there just aren't enough susceptible people to go. For SARS-CoV-B, the best numbers we have is that's 50 to 70% of the population needs to be immune. And the highest numbers we've seen anywhere are in the 15 to 20% range, and that's in Italy and in some of the hardest hit areas. So globally, we're a very long way from herd immunity. So yeah. So and then a vaccine is just a biological trick basically to get your body to respond as if you've been infected with a vaccine, but to have an immune response, and it's a very complicated and difficult process. Under the best scenario, probably 12 to 18 months, and that would be absolutely unprecedented. So I think, Matt, you may have some other comments, or Linda.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, so yeah, I know Linda has been patiently listening here, and after we take our audience questions, we're going to go to something that we're all really interested in, which is the societal response and some of the very interesting psychological and sociological effects that we've been seeing. But first, let's take some questions from our audience. Someone said, "Thank you for holding this and making it available to so many of us. My question is, I've been very vigilant about self-isolating, but I'm trying to determine how to open up my social bubble without available testing. What do you suggest, and how can I begin to socialize with friends?" I know we're all very anxious about the answer to that question.
Yeah, you want to go, Andrew?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's clear that we can't continue social distancing for the next 12 to 18 months. So there's going to have to be serious conversations about what that looks like. In the very short term, it's possible you could pick a very small number of friends who you're very sure have not been exposed and keep that as a very closed social circle. Obviously, everyone needs to go grocery shopping and do everything we all need to do. So it's not foolproof. And yeah, but clearly we're social beings. So that's an important consideration in terms of mental health and just, functioning as a society.
Yeah, it's a tough call. I echo that. I mean, we do sort of virtual pubs, like, via Zoom or Google Hangouts or something like that. But yeah, it's kind of a tricky question.
Yes, it really is. I think having a trustworthy social circle, people that you know and trust are not are properly socially distancing, but everyone sort of has to make that as a personal choice. Is that correct? Or
yeah.
Okay, so we have another question. One is one that we're gonna answer in a later segment. Can you get infected from restaurant takeout food? We have a whole little segment about that, so we'll answer that later. But here's another question. Do we know whether the virus is airborne, whether it could feasibly linger in the air and transmit to you if you walk through it? I know we talked about that a little bit, but there's been competing positions and a little bit of information out there. So how long is this thing airborne, and can you just sort of walk through a cloud of it and get it?
So if someone sneezes right in front of you and you kind of walk through that cloud, then certainly. But those droplets really drop to the floor within a second or two. And there have been a few cases where within hospitals where they're doing very specialized procedures that create very fine aerosols with a machine. And that can lead to problems within a health center. But in terms of normal exposures, it's not a concern.
Yeah, the data I've seen, there are definitely cases of that, but they're usually confined to places with poor air circulation and things like hospitals, bathrooms, things like that. Especially people don't think about this, but it seems like this can be shed in your feces. So flushing the toilet without leaving, like standing up and walking away, that can even actually create this aerosol. So if the circulation is bad, that's a potential route, but it's usually just through that direct close contact.
Great. Another reason why we should definitely wash our hands a lot, and for the 20 seconds and thoroughly with soap. So we have another pretty interesting question. We talked about herd immunity, and some people I've heard say things like, why don't we just have everyone get this and, have like COVID parties and get herd immunity? How far are we from herd immunity? And how do we even know if there's so many asymptomatic cases?
So that's why we're doing antibody testing to look at, antibody tells you anyone that has been infected, either asymptomatic or symptomatic. So you get a total denominator of the number of people that have had a SARS-CoV-2 infection. So in the US, we're probably at 10%. So we're miles away from anywhere close to herd immunity. The big issues are just letting it go means we're going to see massive mortality in elders. So people 70 plus, there'll be just unbelievable mortality. And so that's obviously to be avoided. So Sweden is kind of trying to walk that line, but they're seeing a lot of mortality. The other thing is we have no idea about the long-term impacts of infection. So there's a lot of data that suggests really major kidney and lung problems, especially lung problems, that may be chronic lifetime handicaps. We only have 3 or 4 months of data, so it's really hard to say. But a lot of people recovered in China have like permanent damage to their lungs. And so that's, a coronavirus party sounds, like a, but that's the impact. We have no idea what it could be for long-term outcomes.
All right, well, thank you. Just a reminder to the panelists that they can answer the questions directly that we haven't covered in the Q&A while we're moving on to other topics. And we will touch on more of the nitty-gritty of the virus a bit later. But for right now, let's change topics and talk to Linda a bit about the societal effects of this. So the first question is, we have heard a lot of the physical impacts of COVID-19, and given your specialty, what sort of societal impacts just generally are we seeing of this pandemic?
Yeah, we're seeing many different ways in which COVID-19 has been impacting our social behavior. And I would say, these range from how we act as individual members of a shared community or shared society, and how we act as members of different groups within that society. Along the lines of what Matthew and Andrew were talking about, we're seeing new social norms related to physical distancing, or more commonly referred to as social distancing, such that, without even using words, we're just starting to stand farther away from people that we don't know or who don't live in our household. We also see, as these new social norms are emerging, that there's sometimes some confusion or ambiguity about what to do. So sometimes, we like to have consistency in our social behavior. So if we're standing far away from somebody, we usually don't make eye contact, we don't smile, we kind of put blinders on. So you've often sometimes seen people that you cross on the street, you give each other a wide berth and they just don't even look at you or smile or anything. And then other people try to overcompensate for these changes in norms to let you know that they're friendly and that they don't mean any harm. It's just they're trying to be good citizens. And so people are just trying to adjust, to the best of their ability to these changing social norms. I think also at a broader level, we've seen an incredible emergence of pro-social behavior, where people are really going out of their way to help others through donating meals to healthcare workers, sewing and disseminating masks, giving blood if they have antibodies. There's lots of pro-social behaviors that we've witnessed. And then at the same time, we've seen some very extreme and blatant forms of prejudice targeting certain groups, in particular Asian Americans, who are being disproportionately and inappropriately blamed for this crisis. And, in my mind, this seems like a classic example of scapegoating, where, if we're upset or frustrated by our own position or present circumstances, we try to find somebody to blame as an outlet for our frustration. So those are just some of the examples that I see in the world around us these days.
And is this, are these prejudices and these societal impacts more of local patterns or very specific to the US, or are we seeing this across the world in different cultures?
Particularly in relation to Asians or Asian Americans, unfortunately, I've seen many examples of hate crimes or assaults, or where people are just being yelled at for appearing to be of some Asian background. So it does not seem to be tied exclusively to the US. And I think, some of the other trends that we are seeing with respect to social behavior are also really common, not only in relation to this pandemic worldwide, but also, with other types of crises, whether we're talking about a pandemic or natural disasters or other extreme circumstances. These are the types of situations that have the potential to bring out both the best and the worst in human behavior. So on the one hand, we see a great deal of pro-social behavior where people are actively seeking out to help others. And then we also see some hoarding behavior or prejudice where we're either, trying to protect ourselves potentially at the expense of others, or we're taking out our frustrations on other people.
Interesting. I'm glad to hear about the pro-social behaviors, and I guess crises sort of people say crises bring out the best and the worst in people. Another question that I'm really fascinated in too is this preponderance of conspiracy theories. Things like this was made in a lab, which the virologist could speak to as well, and also things like 5G networks are causing this. Someone in Britain, I think, was trying to burn down a 5G tower, and I know that this has happened with pandemics before, but are these conspiracy theories sort of always in our sphere, but now we're just seeing them more? Or is there truly an elevated kind of conspiracy theory culture out there right now?
So I can't say that I'm a specialist on conspiracy theories, but I can say that, as human beings, one of our primary motivations is to feel a sense of control. At a very basic level, we want to feel safe and secure. And one of the ways that we do that is by feeling a sense of control, particularly when things feel out of control, uncertain, unpredictable. Our minds kind of compel us to come up with ways of understanding the situation and reestablishing a sense of control or a sense of security. So I could imagine that one way that people do that is by coming up with conspiracy theories. Now, unfortunately, there are many prevailing conspiracy theories that exist kind of a little bit more under the radar, but I think because this crisis has brought out so much uncertainty in terms of the future, in terms of the present, in terms of, how we relate to others, that we're hearing more about them, and there's perhaps a greater degree of creativity or preponderance of different types of conspiracy theories that have entered into our midst. I don't know if Matthew or Andrew, if you wish to add at all to that.
Yeah, I mean, from the genetics of the virus, we can tell this is likely just a zoonosis from a bat. There's really no evidence that this was a bioweapon or anything like that. The one thing that maybe could have happened, and I'd still say it's more likely this sort of jumped in like a wet market environment, is that there is a virology institute there, and they may have been studying, animal samples, and apparently maybe not everybody was as trained as they should have been with biosafety, and in theory they could have infected themselves and brought it to the community, but I don't know if we'll ever know that, and I don't think it's really constructive to even start playing that game of who did it and things like that. So
excellent. And I don't even think I'm going to pose a question about the 5G networks. We know that has nothing whatsoever to do with the virus. So another.
If I could add a little bit more just in relation to that issue of uncertainty.
Sure.
I also just want to clarify that conspiracy theories or generating them is not the only way that we try to establish a sense of security or control. A lot of it just has to do more broadly with how we perceive and respond to threats, or what we do when we feel threatened or insecure. So in that quest to try to feel safe and secure as human beings, we might employ a variety of strategies to try to reestablish a sense of safety or security. And part of what some of us might do, we might begin to identify more strongly, like with groups that we belong to, because that gives us a sense of who we are, or a sense of like where we belong in the middle of chaos. And at the same time, we might try to protect our resources or our way of life so that we can feel a sense of security, or at least feel like we have some degree of control or ability to protect our loved ones or people close to us and that we care about. And I think what happens is, if we think about that sense of belonging, where we fit in, being able to protect our loved ones, all of those are fairly self-focused concerns, because we're under duress, we're in crisis, so we're focusing more on our own needs or those needs of people close to us. And so I think some of the broader societal ramifications then involve, well, is there a way to try to balance how we can look out for ourselves and feel secure in the face of threat, and at the same time, to some degree, be mindful about the impacts of our behavior on society at large, or access to resources for everybody. I think that's one of the fundamental challenges that we've been seeing.
That's a great point. And I have one more question to you before we open it up for audience questions for Linda. Why do we react this way to societally traumatizing events, and are these societal effects going to persist even when we return to some level of normalcy?
I think as I study social psychology and psychological processes, I just think about fundamentals of human motivation. And so I think we are always going to have the motivations to protect ourselves, to feel a sense of control, to feel like we belong, to feel that sense of safety and security. I just think we're in a moment of heightened insecurity right now. So we might see these tendencies that we have just being exacerbated or more extreme or more impactful on a day-to-day basis because of the extreme circumstances. So I think, if we think about those circumstances on a day-to-day basis where, somebody cuts us off in traffic and, we get all angry or upset and come up with rationalizations or thoughts about what those people are like in the rest of their lives, not always using the nicest words in our minds. I think we can see how those tendencies would present themselves regardless of the circumstances. So it's kind of part of who we are and our nature as human beings. But I think, we're just seeing more extreme cases right now of people feeling insecure, perhaps lashing out or trying to find any source of relief to feel a sense of safety or security again.
Great, thanks. We have a great audience question here. In addition to these conspiracy theories, this virus is bringing out a lot of distrust in science in general. I see some people lauding Dr. Anthony Fauci as a hero. There's all sorts of memes and things out there floating around, but a lot of people are also distrusting scientists. So how can scientists rebuild trust with the public is a big question.
Yeah, I think this is, again, fairly unprecedented to have such deep distrust of science. And in some ways, they're kind of anti-vaccination. The growth of that movement parallels this in a big way. Along with, there's certainly some political and social media forces that are kind of reinforcing a lot of that. That science is what is going to get us out of this problem with social and political support. So I think it'll have to happen in terms of supporting science in a bigger way. But
I just wanted to add that I think not only are we living in unprecedented times, as is often said, because of this pandemic, but also because we are in an extreme state of polarization politically and socially. So having both of those co-occur feels a lot like a 1-2 punch, right? It's not enough to have a pandemic, but we're having a pandemic in a time where there's already incredible levels of polarization and distrust, not only of scientists, but political parties, of each other, of how government functions. So a lot of the systems that we would normally turn to for reassurance or advice, whether it's government or, you know, our favorite news broadcaster, or who, like Walter Cronkite back in the day, whoever it happens to be, we're just kind of missing those supports that I think exacerbates a lot of the challenges that people are facing now.
Right, and actually, we just got a great audience question that follows up on that. There's a lot of info. We're just getting so much information constantly. If you want to, you could spend all day, every day, just absorbing information from all sorts of media. Is that insecurity, does it decrease with the amount of information that we have, or does it just increase it, basically? Like, is too much information a bad thing?
That's such a great question. I have no idea. I can tell you as a private citizen, not as a scientist, I definitely have to take social media breaks, news breaks. And I think part of it is because we're not necessarily always getting consistent messages, right? I think if the messages that we got through social media, through broadcast news media, were more consistent and tailored and specific, I don't know that we would be grasping quite so much. But I think we're seeing so many different types of messages popping up through so many different types of media sources that it can be overwhelming. And if we think about that media consumption in terms of how our minds actually work, like our minds are programmed to help us process information quickly and simply and efficiently, right? So we like to be what some call cognitive misers, that we try to conserve our cognitive resources, so we only think about things to the extent that we really need to, so that we can attend to other things, right? This is that experience, if you've ever felt like you're in autopilot when you're driving a car, right? That you're not paying attention to every action that you're doing as you drive because it's habitual, it's well practiced, and so it frees up some of your mental resources to focus on other things like my grocery list, what I need to do when I get home, and other stuff like that. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing is with this drive to find more information that we can rely on, and this, you know, constant wave of different types and sources of information, people are just actually exhausted. It's very mentally taxing to try to take in more information than what our normal capacity would suggest. So if people are finding themselves tired or having a harder time concentrating, that's in part because of how the cognitive structures in our brain are functioning. It's like we're overtaxing them. So yeah, just wanted to share that perspective as well.
That is a great point. And man, you know, taking care of your mental health is incredibly important too, and not overloading yourself in this time. So I think there's a bunch of great questions in here, but we're gonna have to move on for a minute, but we will get back to audience questions for all three panelists later. So let's move on for a moment, and we're gonna focus on some interesting questions that we got, mainly directed at Matt for food and food science in general. So the trip to the grocery store has become an incredible event, not something that we are used to at all. So can you just walk us through what are just like what you think are the best practices for grocery store shopping, and what that looks like from the time that we go to the store and also once we get home and we have our groceries in hand?
Yeah, so I guess I can preface this by saying there is no evidence currently that you can get this virus through foods. It is not likely foodborne. It does replicate productively in the intestine, but how it's getting there is not very likely through you eating it and then it going through your digestive system. The viruses traditionally that I study, you know, they've evolved for that. That's the bread and butter. This virus is different in that it has a lipid envelope, and generally you don't see viruses like that being ingested and surviving your stomach acid and then surviving your bile and digestive enzymes. It would just kill so many of the viruses. The level that you would need to ingest to even get some that survive to potentially infect you is quite a bit higher than you would normally see in traditional foodborne transmission. So that's sort of the first preface. But in terms of going to the grocery store, go alone. Don't bring anybody else with you, you know, for your household. Try and really plan out what you're going to need so you limit the number of trips that you make to the grocery store as much as you can. Try and know what you want. I'm pretty bad about this. I don't normally make a list or anything like that, but you know, the longer you stay in there, the more risk you expose yourself to, and the more risk you expose others to. Wear a mask. Try and really respect physical distancing. I know a lot of grocery stores around this area have been great about only letting a certain number of people in and having like a bunch of markations on the floor. Some of them have arrows directing flow. I don't really think they work very well. I don't think people respect them that much. But really just using your judgment and trying to stay, you know, at least 6 feet away from other people, and you know, doing that really, that's because that's how you get it, as you mentioned. Other than that, like, you just going home, I don't, you know, again, if it makes you feel better, you know, you could, you know, when you put your bags down, wipe off your counter or something like that. But outside of that, you know, I think the surfaces that, you know, people get hung up on a lot, you know, the surfaces you should be caring about disinfecting the most, because, you know, not all disinfectants are in an infinite supply, is those high touch surfaces like doorknobs, handles, things like that. Don't touch your face, obviously, you know, wash your hands for 20 seconds with soap and water, or use ethanol hand sanitizer. But like, just the common sense things that people have been saying are fine enough. It's really just trying to avoid contact with other people.
Yeah, and it seems like it's almost become a ritual. Some people have all these sort like sanitizing the food itself, like vegetables. Like, should you be washing your vegetables with soap and water or something, or is that a terrible idea?
That's a terrible idea. Absolutely don't do that. You can sicken yourself even with soap, which is not designed for you to be ingesting large amounts of. Bleach especially, don't do that. Yeah, just run it under water. You don't need to add anything else, which is, you know, just normal good food safety practice anyway. Like for your vegetables, don't wash meat like chicken, because if there is bacteria on there, usually it's at a higher level and you can spread it. Yeah, you don't need, like, I've heard of people like sanitizing their mail and sanitizing each individual thing of food. You know, disinfectants and disinfectant wipes are not in an infinite supply. I would not focus on doing that, because it's not just like that you can detect it on a surface. So maybe in theory somebody did deposit it on a food packaging surface, but then on top of that, just because it's on there, it's not necessarily going to jump and fly over into your nasal passages, right? You have to touch it, then you have to touch your face, and that transfer efficiency is something we still don't know. That's one of the things we want to study in my lab, but it's really, you know, where you end up with that kind of surface-based transfer, it has to have a fairly high load of virus, and it's usually like those high-touch surfaces, things like that people should be prioritizing, in addition to just limiting exposure to other people.
Right, that's a good point. And honestly, if you end up in the hospital with food poisoning, you're probably more likely to get COVID than if you just like didn't do that in the first place. So kind of a follow-up and related to that is, what are my risks getting takeout? A lot of us want to support local businesses. Are we safe, or are we going to be getting the virus from the takeout, from the food, or from the container?
Yeah, I wouldn't focus on the food or the container. It's really just your interaction with those other, especially employees that you may be interacting with. So if there's any kind of no contact method of picking it up in terms of takeout, or, you know, like a number of restaurants, at least locally in Northampton, they deliver. I also recommend, and this is maybe a more social thing, I don't know if people have seen it, but like, you know, Grubhub and those sort of apps take a big portion off of these small businesses in terms of the money they make. So if there is a way of just directly calling the restaurant and having them, you know, deliver it to you, that's another thing. It's not related to safety at all. It's just, you know, to support the restaurants as much as possible. But yeah, you know, trying to like make a no contact delivery, or I've seen a number of restaurants in Northampton where they kind of have like a table set up where like they end up placing it and then walking back away, so you maintain social distancing when you pick it up. Things like that. So really just limiting your interaction with other people.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that. Getting takeout these days is a real treat, since you can't really go anywhere. It's nice and it feels good just to support local businesses too. So another question, we've been hearing a lot in the news about food processing, especially these food processing plants, the pork facilities that were shut down because hundreds of employees are tested positive. and some of them are now coming back online. I know the president declared that they're essential, so they have to go back online. Should we be worried about meat products and other food sources that may have been contaminated in these food processing facilities?
No, the real concern there with the food processing is just to make sure that we don't run out of food, which I wouldn't anticipate. But it's really the issue there is because this is so transmissible and because of just what's demanded in a food processing and production environment, a lot of these employees are exposing each other, transmitting it to each other, and then they're getting sick and calling out and things like that. That's the main concern. It's not that, you're going to, get the, meat or chicken and then somehow get it. And then on top of that, you should be cooking your meat correctly to like the proper temperature, where this virus, the good news about it, especially from transmission aspect, is it's weak. The norovirus, which is one of the main viruses that we study in our lab, is not that weak. So that virus, you can't kill it with ethanol. You can't kill it with most commercial disinfectants. Whereas with this virus, with SARS-CoV-2, you can. So just normal, good food safety practices should keep you fine. It's really the workers.
Right, which we all feel for them.
Yeah.
And so related to food safety is diet in general. Some questions had to do with, does having a certain diet like high red meat or sugar diet potentially put you at a higher risk for complications of this? Should we be changing our dietary habits in light of this?
There is a lot is still yet to be known, but definitely one thing that seems to be very highly correlated with complications is having other what they call comorbidities, specifically like cardiovascular disease, or if you had previous lung disease, things like that. So just trying to make sure that you're healthy, or if you have some sort of cardiovascular issue, that you're just super cautious. There is some suggestion, because it is linked to immunity, that vitamin D, making sure you're not deficient in vitamin D is a good thing. Again, a lot of this information is constantly changing, but I would recommend that, if you don't think you're getting enough vitamin D, that you maybe consider supplementation, which I believe in some countries like the UK, they're actually already administering vitamin D in hospitals. There is a preprint that I've seen from Thailand where they actually did, it was like pretty substantially, people that were, vitamin D was pretty substantially associated, but again, that hasn't been subject to peer review. But it couldn't hurt to potentially, just in a responsible level, like not overdosing it or doing something like that, but just a responsible level to make sure that you're getting the proper nutrition, especially things like vitamin D, and then maybe going out into the sun, things like that. But outside of that, there really isn't.
So where in your diet do you get vitamin D?
It's supplemented into milk. You can get it from a number of meat sources. You also make it when you go outside in the sun. And so that's the other thing is, not entirely cloistering yourself and making sure you're taking care of your mental health and going out and getting, some degree of activity.
I'm muted. All right, great. So we're going to open it up to audience questions. If anyone has any questions about the food aspects of this, or the viral aspects of this, I could take a few of those. One question we did get here, which anyone here could answer, is we often hear about waves of epidemic. So in particular, a fall wave is frequently mentioned. What is the mechanism behind this wave? Is it seasonal variation, or is it more of a transmission probability thing?
It may well be a combination of both. Certainly in the fall, people spend a lot more time indoors and closer proximity, and maybe you start shutting your windows. So the best data we have is from the 1918 flu pandemic. And probably the first wave were people who were especially susceptible and maybe had a lot of social contacts, and so they were sick in first. And then there was social distancing, and then that kind of faded away, and then they had a second and a third wave. It's entirely possible and probable that we'll see a second or third wave, just because so few people have been exposed and have immunity. So we should assume that we will. Whether or not it happens in August or September is really hard to say. And we don't expect seasonality to be a huge issue because we're seeing really intense transmission in Malaysia and Singapore and places with really tropical climates. So.
Great. Also, another question here, hand sanitizer is really hard to find lately. I was just able to get some myself like this week. And how do we know if something, it says like kills 99.9% of germs on the bottle, some are being produced by like distilleries and these sorts of things. Like, how do we know if a hand sanitizer is good to use or not?
I mean, well, the number one thing to look at is ethanol, is the alcohol content. It seems pretty broadly, just as a class, different alcohols, are quite effective. Usually you want to be above 60%, ideally 70% alcohol in your hand sanitizer. But a number of other chemical disinfectants are pretty effective against this virus. Again, like it's really more of a just human, making sure you're applying disinfectants, following the instructions, making sure you're cleaning before disinfecting. So that's one thing people often overlook. If you have a bunch of dirt that's on there, they call it an organic load. You have a bunch of other crap that the chemicals in that disinfectant are going to react with, and they're not going to react with the virus. But yeah, this is a fairly susceptible virus. So for most common disinfectants, you would expect them to be at least effective enough that, on, the level you're going to see on surfaces is going to be completely wiped out if you apply it properly. For the proper contact time, that's another element, is not immediately wiping up after, because disinfectants take time. And so if you actually read the instructions on the disinfectants, they usually give you a time to allow it to have its effect before you wipe it up.
Great, thank you. So at this stage, we're going to open it up to just an open question and answer. The questions could be directed at all three panelists, and I'll sort of throw questions at you as we come in. I know you've been busy also answering questions by typing out, which is really nice. So I am going to start, let's see here. There's a particular question that I liked. So this one's directed at Linda. What lessons can we use to improve our current and future reactions to such events? Because some of us are kind of disturbed and saddened by some of the reactions by people. So how can we take this and use it to improve our reaction to events in the future?
Oh, that's a really good question. In some ways I see, or my thinking about it kind of grows from what I had started to share earlier about understanding how our minds work. That if we kind of have a clear understanding that, taking in only so much information can be taxing for us after a while, and that we might need a break, that might help us kind of, maintain a bit more of an equilibrium over the long haul. If we also think about the fact that, that's also part of why we engage in, thinking about people in terms of social categories and creating stereotypes associated with those categories, because it's kind of a very quick and easy way for us to process information in our social worlds. But just because those are kind of natural processes built into our mind as a system, it doesn't mean we can't override them. So also, trying to be a bit reflective or mindful about how we're responding to things can give us more insight into kind of our natural tendencies or certain triggers that might lead us to feel a little bit more out of whack or less at a sense of equilibrium. And at another very basic level that I think is also kind of related to thinking about, understanding how our minds work is also, we have a lot of time with ourselves these days where we can kind of learn more about how we respond to things. So if we feel angry about something, really try to investigate, well, why am I angry? Instead of just being reactive or necessarily lashing out, is it just because I'm feeling stressed? I know it's like this old yarn, but the more we recognize what's going on, the less power those reactive tendencies have. And I think that would probably serve us really well to just spend a little bit of time being a bit more reflective. And I think related to that also on some level, really just kind of accepting the circumstances that we're in. I think, because we have a sense of wanting to be in control, or in control of our surroundings or our life chances, we don't like the fact that we're in the situation, right? It's really frustrating a lot of the time. And if we don't kind of recognize it for what it is, then we might try to change that reality or react against it somehow, which might not be the healthiest for us, either physically or psychologically or emotionally. So if we can find ways to just really accept, okay, so this is the situation that I'm in. What are my choices given that? That might ease a lot of stress or suffering about things that we can't control. So trying to kind of get clarity about what is within our control and what's not within our control, and to use our kind of emotional and cognitive and mental resources accordingly.
Absolutely, that is great advice. So I have a question that Andrew would like to answer. It's that this person prefaces by the fact that they're not pushing any conspiracy theory, but they still haven't read anything that lays out specifics regarding the Wuhan lab. Read many reports on how the genetics of the virus precludes the possibility of man-made origin. However, some reports leave open the possibility of that accidental leak that you mentioned. Your previous answer seems to leave the possibility open that it may not be something to focus on. Are there any genetic reasons that exclude the possibility of an accidental leak?
So basically, it sounds like the Wuhan lab was involved in some studies with EcoHealth Alliance, which is a research organization that samples viruses from the environment, so from bats and pangolins and whatever species they can capture, specifically for global pathogen surveillance. And so it's entirely possible that they had similar viruses from natural sources in their lab. And as Matthew said, it's possible they had a laboratory worker who maybe wasn't as careful as they should have been while they were handling it. The bottom line is, it's essentially impossible to ever know. Certainly with the wet markets and the wildlife for sale, it easily could have been there in terms of kind of a neighborhood level transmission, or it could have been a laboratory sample that was in the freezer for a while from a natural source. And yeah, and in terms of our response and the kind of the epidemiology, it doesn't change anything. So, vaguely historically interesting, but not relevant to our response. Yeah.
Although maybe not relevant to the response in terms of developing treatments and social distancing, but possibly the political response to it, having someone to specifically blame.
Sure.
It seems like really could be maybe even a reason why some people want to figure out if it was an accidental leak or if it just happened to show up in a market.
Yeah.
So I have another interesting question. I guess this could apply to all of the panelists in some way, but I think mainly directed at Linda. What effect did the 1918 pandemic have on social institutions, and what lessons from that pandemic can we apply to COVID-19?
Oh gosh, I really hope someone else on this panel can respond to this question. I'm not a historian. I've just been reading independently on the 1918 pandemic, and what comes to mind for me is just thinking about how differently our society is structured. That at the time, whether in our country or in other countries, people lived more in family units as compared to having much more transitory lifestyles where siblings and parents are living farther apart due to jobs and things like that. So I don't know, Andrew or Matthew, if either of you have more information about that from historical perspective.
I think the 1918 pandemic had major demographic repercussions because the primary people who had mortality were quite young, like working age people, like 15 to 20. So that had a big impact going forward in terms of the workforce globally. And it's been postulated that had some kind of downstream political effects. Just in a lot of countries, the prime working age population was diminished. I'm not sure we know enough yet. I mean, I think we're seeing, again, truly unprecedented global kind of competition and rifts in theories and in terms of countries actively competing for PPE. If or when we have a vaccine, that's going to be exacerbated greatly in terms of countries that can either manufacture it quickly or afford to buy it from other countries that can. So, yeah, I mean, there's going to be huge continuing social repercussions. And even countries that have really strong social support networks, it's been easier for them to ask their populations to be stay at home for months on end. So that, yeah, there's definitely a lot.
And this kind of relates to this. So this is a question aimed at all three panelists. Are there differences between how the U.S. is handling this pandemic versus other countries? I know that there's also, it seems like, different societal responses, such as Japan seemed to almost be in denial about what is happening versus Australia, which locked down really quickly. So I guess this posed to all three panelists, do you see any differences in the handling, and if there's a difference in effectiveness?
Yeah, there definitely is differences between countries, and you're seeing the ones that reacted sooner are, they have lower mortalities, lower rates of things like that. And so hopefully, after, ideally we have a vaccine and stuff and we look back, people will learn from it. One thing I think that kind of jumps out to me that sort of maybe differentiates the US from other countries or an element to consider is just how there's a lack of uniformity in the response across different states. And as was mentioned earlier, you now have states reopening that are potentially going to affect states that did the right thing. So yeah, I would say our response is much less than optimal.
Yeah, and following up on what Matthew was just saying, in addition to the lack of uniformity at the state level, we're also seeing a real lack of uniformity at the individual level, where there are these protests in, different parts of our country, speaking about individual rights, and so there's like what I fear will happen is that those who are out protesting and not wearing masks as a sign of individual freedom, that they either will put themselves or members of their family more at risk. And I would hope that there would be other ways to learn about the risk of transmission without having members of those families have to fall to the virus or pass because of illness.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there was actually an audience question really related to that is how do we avoid misinformation? And also, how do we have productive conversations with those around us who might feel like their freedoms are being taken away in shutdowns, which is a valid concern?
One of the things that really struck me was after 9/11, a lot of people who would very much identify as Americans or as American patriots were very happy to stand in line to be screened by airport screeners for national security reasons. So I think there's the potential or the capacity for social distancing measures, wearing masks, to all be framed in very patriotic ways. And I think this is where that particular challenge associated with these forms of polarization and upheavals that we're experiencing politically happening concurrently with this pandemic, I think that's part of what's creating such high infection and death rates in the US, because we're not getting consistent messages. We don't have like a coherent message really at any level. Presently, and I think that's a real problem. Navigate these societies together as best we can.
Thank you. And so I have another question here, a specific one. My 82-year-old mom has been cooped up in her condo since March 17th. She has food delivered to her door, but she hasn't been exposed to anyone, including family. When can we visit her? I know this is a concern, especially for elderly folks who may be really isolated right now. So I guess this could be directed at whoever wants to answer.
I wouldn't visit her right now. Honestly, you may have to wait. I mean, it depends how much risk you want to assume, especially given the fact that you can asymptomatically be shedding it. So that's just sort of a personal decision, but do know that if you do go, there is the possibility that you are asymptomatic and could be potentially exposing that person to risk.
Yeah, it's difficult, especially with older folks who may not, be as adapted to the online environment and using tablets. And just wondering, like, how to keep them involved and happy and motivated and feel like they're with, a community, basically.
Yeah, that's tough.
I mean, I suspect there are enough grandchildren out there who are very well skilled at using smartphone or tablet technology that could program any apps that might be necessary, swab them down and drop them off at or send them to their grandparents' homes, perhaps even with guides about how to use them. It's funny, I think we have this narrative of older people or senior citizens as being really, less in touch with technology. I keep thinking the older that I get, I'm like, wow, today's grandparents listen to Led Zeppelin in their youth. They're not, the same elderly that we might have thought of. Like they've been parts of cultural revolutions. And so I suspect that, there may be some truth, but there's also, perhaps some stereotype as well that they're not as skilled at technology or not as capable of using it, especially if they're sufficiently motivated to connect with family. That's a pretty strong motivator.
That is a great point. Yes. It's just making me feel older and older the more I think about that. So we have another question here from the audience. What are the chances that this goes on for years and not months? Are we overly hopeful about unprecedented vaccine development? People saying a vaccine will arrive in a year and a half, because there are some things we've never found vaccines for and other ones don't last. So lay out the worst case scenario, I guess, and also maybe the best case scenario.
Well, so the WHO has released a statement that says simply that we don't have enough data to establish that you have protective immunity after infection, and we don't know how long if you do. But that doesn't mean that you don't establish protective immunity. It just means we don't have data yet because it's still too early. In terms of if I was going with my gut, I would say if I were betting, probably most people probably do develop immunity. That would be if I were betting. But again, we don't have enough data to really say one way or the other. So the worst case scenario would be, you can potentially get reinfected with this virus, and a vaccine wouldn't work. But again, we don't know, and I don't think it's constructive to really panic at this point about that. The best case scenario, and I've heard there is a vaccine that's already beginning, that's I believe underway in terms of human trials, and they seem to be extremely optimistic about getting results and seeing if it'll work. Like they're saying something like 4 to 6 months. Granted that after that you then have to ramp up production of it, but still, so there is some cause for optimism. But then the whole other thing is antivirals, looking for effective antivirals, which there seems to be a number of other antiviral candidates as well as immunotherapy options. So the good news is it does seem like people are actively moving, and I would anticipate that we at least have something to mitigate the burden of this within the next year.
I think really the best case scenario is we'll have better drugs for treatment, and much better treatment protocols. So as for influenza, we have decades and decades of data from hospitals to know how to treat people really well, to keep mortality down. And that's being developed bit by bit. So in terms of, again, influenza, we have a new influenza vaccine every year because it changes. We don't have evidence that we'll see something similar. but it's quite probable we'll have seasonal transmission of SARS-CoV going forward. It's a bit difficult to see how we'd have any other outcome right now. So it will be with us, but the question is, can we control the outcomes better? And then one final thing, in terms of vaccines, once we have a vaccine candidate, we're going to have to produce hundreds of millions and billions of doses. And vaccine manufacturing capacity is really specialized and usually booked out several years in advance. So it will take a lot of global coordination, and then just physically transporting billions of doses and administering it is going to be a really major logistical challenge for every country.
That's a great point. I mean, everyone's thinking, once the vaccine arrives, we're good, but billions of people will have to take these vaccines, and if it's a multi-dose vaccine or if it needs some sort of specialized delivery methods rather than just a pill, it may be incredibly hard to get it ready. Even if it is done in record time, getting it to everyone is a whole other story.
Yeah, and we're seeing that pretty much every area of our medical infrastructure has been affected by this virus and exposing quite a few gaps. Even vaccines going to be no different than like PPE or ventilators or something like that. And as Andrew said, it's going to be even harder.
Right. Okay, we'll try to get to a few other audience questions before we wrap up here. So this is a question for Matt. Why don't we see novel viruses jumping from animals to humans more often?
There are numerous factors for that. Bats, just as a species, bats are really good. They harbor the most zoonotic viruses by far, and zoonotic diseases in general that jump to humans because they're basically flying mammals. There are a number of factors. So it seems like it's related to mutations in the receptor. So as mammals, we have a lot of things in common with ourselves to some degree, even if they're slightly different. And so they're especially once you get inside the cell, the machinery of a lot of the way that our cells replicate and operate is somewhat conserved. So in a lot of cases, it's just a slight mutation that it'll jump to from humans, and once it gets inside, it's pretty much subverting the same machinery in a bat as it would with a human. In this case, it specifically looked like there was a change in the spike protein that helped facilitate the jump. But it's not as common because viruses tend to like having a specific host and have a very specific host range, and that varies between different viruses. So yeah, there's a lot of factors there that you consider specifically. But yeah, usually viruses, they'll have a set host range or a set of tissues that they want to infect, and they're happy with that.
Great, thank you for that answer. There was one answer that Linda already answered by typing out, but I thought it was a great question, so I want to repose it. Why in times of crisis is it so hard to think as a group like the social animals that we really are rather than as separate individuals?
Yeah, so just to kind of summarize and expand a bit on what I wrote, we actually do think about ourselves as members of groups, but we're probably just more exclusive or insular in framing the boundaries of those groups in times of crisis or when we experience threat. So, rather than necessarily seeing each other as part of a global community, you can imagine how it's a lot easier to do that when you're not under duress, when you're not under crisis or experiencing threat, right? Because then you're more willing to be generous and open to everybody. It's under periods of threat or crisis when we get a little more protective, a little more defensive, and we, perhaps become a little more hierarchical in terms of our willingness to share resources, whether it's like actual resources like food, water, toilet paper at the supermarket, or whether it's like social emotional resources like caring about other people's pain or what they're going through. So I think a lot of it has to do with, we only have a certain amount of, mental and emotional information that we can handle and process at any moment in time. And so if we're already caring a lot and spending a lot of attention and energy focusing on our people or people that we would regard as being part of our group, then we'll probably be less willing to expend energy or just have less energy to spare to care about those others. And that's just a very general process that, occurs in this pandemic. But we can also see examples of this, when we think about the fact that there are, wars and other types of diseases that are affecting people in other parts of the world that we usually don't really think about or care about. It's because this is affecting us as well that we're starting to think like, oh, what's happening in other countries too. But would that necessarily mean that we would want to share our PPE equipment with other countries? It's like, we want to make sure we have enough for us first here at home. So we do kind of use those category boundaries in part to portion out our levels of concern. And how much we attend to it. And it's hard under these types of circumstances to expand those moral circles. But those are actually some of the things that we're thinking about, like, how can we do that? What strategies have we seen used? And can this be a special moment because we are all sharing some similarities in experience that might enhance our capacity to care more broadly? But it's a tall order.
Right, absolutely. Okay, I think, let's see. I'm going to ask one more audience question. The panelists have been great for sticking around, and we really appreciate it. And for those in the audience, if you look at the answered tab on the audience questions, you could see some of the typed out answers that the panelists had typed out for those, which is really great. And we've had some great questions so far. I think I'll do one more question, and then we'll pose our final sort of wrap up. So it looks like, let's see. Here it is. Okay, so kind of a simpler question. I think you said something about how long it takes sanitizer to work. So some people have been using it on counters and washing it off right away. How long does a sanitizer need to be in contact with the surface to work? And this was directed at Matt.
Yeah, so if you actually buy like a bottle of Lysol or something like that, they'll usually list sort of a time that they recommend. Usually, like, it's always, to play it safe, 10 to 20 minutes. It's really a matter of reducing risk. So it is possible, because often a lot of times environmental transmission of virus, it's not at really high levels on an environmental surface. So it is possible that immediately, like if you only have like 10 viral particles there and you spray it, it kills all 10 immediately. There's a possibility of that, but you want to give yourself the best shot of ensuring that it's completely destroyed. And so just to play it safe, I would follow the minutes that are in the back that are recommended in terms of the contact time. But you can find it on like the instructions for use on the label.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pose one final question to all the panelists. So I'll just go kind of around. So what do you think the biggest impacts of COVID-19 are? And then just to sort of try to end this on a cheery note, what are you most optimistic about with this whole thing? And I'll start with Andrew for that
one. So what am I most optimistic about? I think it's definitely forcing or facilitating some big conversations at the global level in terms of how public health architecture should be structured. And then here nationally, it's really catalyzing thought about state departments of health and the resources they need to do most of their core functions. Public health has been kind of defunded and deprioritized for a long time, and we're starting to see the impacts here and with opiates. So that's the silver lining, I think.
Great, thank you. And Linda?
I think for me, the preponderance of pro-social behavior, and oftentimes unsolicited, or where people are really seeking out opportunities to make a difference, to help their neighbors. It just shows the incredible potential and capacity that we have to be kind to each other and to be generous toward each other. And I hope that following this experience, we can just find a way to integrate that more regularly into our day-to-day lives.
Great, thanks. And Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the impact, not just in terms of public health burden, but on the economy is going to be quite substantial. I think optimistically, in addition to, I echo what Andrew said in terms of, making people aware of how valuable public health and virological research is. But in addition to that, I also think that this has given us time to really understand and appreciate how a lot of essential workers are, in our society who've traditionally been overlooked are extremely important. And so hopefully, I've seen things like bills like for people's medical school debt to get relieved and things like that. And hopefully, as a society after this, we'll realize a lot of these essential workers and people that we've found so important that we reciprocate our appreciation of what they've done.
That's a great sentiment to leave it off with. So with that, such a special thank you for all the panelists for all your great information and for answering so many questions, sticking around so long with us. And I would like to have a thank you to the Life Science Cafe organizers who volunteered and putting so much time and work to prepare for this special edition of the Life Science Cafe. There is going to be a recording of this available at oebsciencecafe.org. And also, I hope to see many of you next week for our journey into the world of paleontology, which will be a fun sort of break from all the coronavirus news and information. So stay safe and well, everyone, and I wish you all well, and thank you again to the panelists.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.